Hey, hi, hello. Is this thing on? I think so. Anyway, here goes. This is Lysa OS. I'm a gnome, and, yes, a practitioner of the arcane arts with a specialty in evocation magic, specifically fire. But not for nefarious reasons. When you start your adventuring career fighting hordes of zombies in the service of a twisted necromancer, you just get really good at casting firebolt and fireball and scorching ray and wall of fire. In any case, enough about little me. You're listening to Campaign Spotlight. Have a wonderful time.
Hey there, urchins advocates and renowned corpse thieves.
In this week's episode, we're chatting with David about self-publishing tabletop role-playing games.
Let's roll initiative.
Yesterday is a city of smoke. Rainwater falls over drenched cobblestones. The city is a maze of crooked alleyways and soaring buttresses. One could walk for years within the city without seeing its edge, for those born within yesterday's embrace are seldom allowed to leave. Yesterday is powered by coal and the movement of shoulder blades, hauling carts, pushing trams. In the streets, you pass laborers. Do not ask their names, for yesterday is a city of secrets. In the crystal spires high above the smog, a single flower carefully placed could spell death to your enemies. In dank gutters and locked drawing rooms, forlorn souls peer at the edges of patterns, luminous and beautiful. Do not follow them, for yesterday is a city of stasis. None can remember a time when the city was not so. Gunsmiths and playwrights have come and gone, but the city has stood eternal. But that may be changing. The ravens in their parliament in their bell tower speak of new lights in the sky. The sound of chimes echoes from beneath the stones for those that long to hear it. And new, heretical schools of art are on display at Mayline's gallery. In the gallery's entryway, see the soulful-eyed boy keeping the guests' eyes on him, and away from the door where the man in the actuarial bearing signals that all is well. Past him, the woman in the dress 3 years out of fashion wipes blood off a silver-barreled gun. She watches as a man with a raven on his shoulder levers a painting covered by a tarp out a window. The painting is lowered and lashed to the roof of a car by a scoundrel. He peers under the tarp and makes eye contact with the sculpted impasto. For a moment, something passes through the misty air, and two new pupils take root in his eyes, faded and dashing. Wordlessly, he knows. They're after me. And now, they'll be after you.
Wow, that was incredible. Wow. David, welcome to Campaign Spotlight.
Thank you.
That was such an incredible monologue. I apologize for just kind of sitting in awe for a moment. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Could you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Hi, I'm David from beautiful Toronto, Canada. I started GMing kind of my third year of university. And I have been GMing kind of for 7 years straight ever since. In that time, I have run 29 campaigns, including in a wide variety of games, including 13 games that I designed myself.
Sorry, how many of those games are you running at any given time?
Two weekly games.
2 weekly games every week?
Yes, 2 weekly games, each of which is once a week, yes.
Incredible. And for the systems you built yourself, are you typically always running a game with the system that you've built yourself?
It's definitely gone up over time as I've gotten more comfortable with it. But it varies. I pick the system which best fits the campaign I want to run and my players want to play, which might be an off-the-shelf system or might require custom work.
That makes a lot of sense. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got into making games in the first place?
Yeah. There was a campaign. I was actually starting out. I had some new players coming in. We played a world-building game called Microscope to kind of figure out what kind of campaign setting we were looking for. I know you guys have discussed Microscope before.
Riley and I are nodding. We really liked Microscope, honestly.
It's a great game. And we came up with this very cool kind of Horizon Zero Dawn pre-agricultural fantasy jungle setting. Nowadays, I'd probably run Wild Sea for that setting, but Wild Sea was not out at the time. And I had like a 2-week break because I was out of town, and I figured during those 2 weeks, I couldn't find a game that really fit what I wanted to do, so I figured I'd try out making my own. It's called Scavenger World. It was a straight-up hack of Apocalypse World, like a one-for-one the same mechanics, but with different setting and playbooks.
Very cool. And then since then, you've built systems that are a little bit more of a departure from existing games. Although I guess a lot of them are kind of powered by the apocalypse-ish.
Yeah, all of them are powered by the apocalypse, although most of them are not as close to an existing game as that game was to literal Apocalypse World.
No, that makes sense. And I'm excited to talk about some of the games you've made. Let's get into it. Your monologue is from a campaign in a setting that you call Blood and Velvet?
Yeah, the setting is the city of yesterday. The game is Blood and Velvet. This was a Gothic occult noir story set in a drenched, gloomy, Victorian-esque, endless city, as I discussed in the monologue. It's the story of a group of petty thieves who, upon being tasked to steal a painting, something jumps off the page of the painting and into one of their minds. And suddenly, there's a lot of people who are suddenly very interested in them and want them dead and or the thing back. And they have to figure out, what is this thing? Why is it in James's mind? What do we do about it? How do we not get killed? And eventually they discover, this is also partially a mystery game, they discover that the girl incarnations, which is the name of the painting and the name of the being, is actually a noblewoman from outside of yesterday, from a place called Under Green Skies. If yesterday is a city of eternal stasis, Under Green Skies is a place of eternal change, where everyone loses all of their memories each dawn. Ooh. And they, with Anira Damask, the noblewoman, find the way between yesterday and Under Green Skies. And in the second half of the campaign, the fact that they have this very valuable way out of yesterday makes a whole new set of people very interested in them. And they have to discover, why are the paths between yesterday and Under Green Skies getting bigger and more accessible? What will happen when they become big enough that most people can find them? And who is planning to do something nefarious with that? And how do we stop them? This game, it's played in a system called Blood and Velvet that is mostly based on a game called Blades in the Dark. There's a whole school of games based on Blades in the Dark called Forged in the Dark games. They're all about heists and managing stress and vice and downtime. It's a very tense system, good for heists. It also incorporated a system from a game called Norlandia called the Corkboard. So during the downtime part of this game, you literally build out a corkboard. Like you put leads, you pin them to a board, and you draw strings between them, indicating the different parts of the unraveling mystery you found and how they're connected to each other. And I liked that system so much that it's so far the only system I've ever typed up nice and proper and turned into a book that you can read right now on itch.io for free.
We will absolutely link to that. I think this is such a fun and flavorful setting for a party that's composed of thieves or for a heist. And I really like how the that initial incident gets them in way over their heads really quickly.
Yeah, that's the noir part. Noir is all about in my view, noir is all about unlikely heroes that don't want to be part of a mystery, but they're stuck in one anyways.
Oh, absolutely. This is such a fun set of genre tropes, down to the literal corkboard. Before we move on, I have to ask, Did the players literally have a physical corkboard in person?
Unfortunately, I was all online by that point, so it was a digital corkboard, but it did get very out of hand by the end. I had to start moving the strings like around the edge because I couldn't throw them over all the leads in the middle.
And did that actually come into how they solved the mysteries? Yes.
I mean, the mechanics of the game say that you have to string leads to perform missions, and you have to perform missions to solve the mystery. Like, it's a game about a mystery, but none of the players, including myself, know the answer to the mystery when the game starts. And so it's like one of the players' moves allows them to invent new leads and add them to the corkboard, and some of those leads ended up being part of the solution to the mystery.
That is, I really like how in this context the mechanics and the system that you're working with really do line up so well with the tropes and the genre that you're working with, right? Like this is a system in which you play this kind of story in particular.
Yeah. A lot of Powered by the Apocalypse games are like that. They are for one very specific type of story.
Yes. And because you've also played other campaigns and systems that looked very different from this, but also that had some very specific genre elements to them.
Yeah. Should I talk about another one?
Sure. Yeah. Let's talk about a couple of them.
Sure. I'm going kind of chronological order of these three games.
Sounds
this
good.
Is Perennial Ultimatum. This is a political game about colonization and rebellion and industrial fantasy in the magical land of fairy. There dwell creatures called fairies, and they have a long kind of pseudo-medieval history until one day humans arrived over the mountains with their machines of war and begin colonizing and conquering and settling. And our story is set 25 years after First Contact. That tells the story of the Perennial Ultimatum, an unlikely group of rebels that eventually grows into a popular movement that is able to cut the humans off from their homeland to prevent any more from coming over the mountains. So I said I have 2 weekly games, and usually those are 2 different campaigns that are unrelated to each other, because they're actually quite different groups. But for Perennial Ultimatum, the 2 groups were playing the same campaign. So both groups were parties in the same world, part of the same group, and stuff that happened in one group would affect the other. And they actually played 2 completely different systems. One group was in the city of Wilhelm's Folly, kind of the point of First Contact, the concentration of most humans in Fairy. And they played a game that was actually very similar to Blood and Velvet, just without the corkboard elements. And the other group kind of traveled all over in their airship, putting out fires and dealing with humans wherever they tried to expand. And they played a game, also powered by the Apocalypse, that used a mechanic from a game called The Veil, called The States. What The Veil had, and what this game had, was that instead of having stats that were associated with moves or actions, instead you had 6 emotion stats. Joy, sadness, powerful, peaceful, mad, scared. And every time you roll, you describe how you feel, and how you feel determines which stat you roll with.
And that's the game that you built or that you adapted for this campaign.
Yeah, well, yes, both of those games are games that I kind of built for that campaign.
Right, because Blood and Velvet is the one from the first campaign.
Yes.
And so these players were playing as fairies, and so they is part of how we should think of this. Them being fae means that they had these outsized emotions, and that's why you went with this kind of mechanic.
Yeah, in the world building, we kind of came with emotional magic, and that magic is very tied to your emotions, and I wanted to reflect that. It ended up being a great fit for that group of players in particular, who kind of love to talk about like their characters' drama and feelings.
Oh, absolutely. I'm used to having players like that, and candidly, no idea how to deal with it mechanically. Did these 2 groups end up interacting at any point?
For scheduling reasons, they couldn't like talk face to face for basically the whole campaign. But there were so this game had a mechanic common to both sides called support. So at the end of each session, on both sides, I asked the players 3 questions. Let me see if I can just find the questions. It's in one of these tabs.
That would be great.
Yes. Did we defeat challenges above our scale? Did we bolster our reputation or develop a new one? Did we improve the lives of fairies in need? The lives of fairies in need. And for each yes answer, the whole group, both groups, would get +1 support. and every 10 support, the movement would expand by a factor of like 30. So like go from like a small group of C's into something with like a real organization, into like a proper army. And every time it expanded, there were decisions that had to be made about how the group would expand, which they decided to vote on. And so there were votes that went on in the Discord that got quite contentious by the end.
And these are votes against votes including both of the two groups.
Yeah, like I told them, you decide how your rebellion is run. I have no opinions about whether this is a democracy or a dictatorship, but they decided it would be a democracy, and then they immediately began squabbling each other because they didn't agree about what to do next. And then there was the finale. In the finale, I managed to get all 9 players plus myself into one call, and we all played one game together.
That is the most heroic scheduling superpower I've ever heard of. Getting 10 people in the same room to play a tabletop game at the same time. Congratulations on that.
The virtual room, but it was quite a miracle that it happened. I did a really cool thing for that last campaign. So in the foreground, we played a game called Follow by Ben Robbins, which is like, it's by the same person who made Microscope. It's about a group of people going on a quest. But in the background, I sent each player a custom PDF document, and it started with 10 like prompts. So it might be like, if one player was like a musician, I said like, you're developing a new experimental instrument with millions of horns out in the desert, and then it said 37. And what that player could do is send that prompt to any other player at any time, just in the background without saying anything during the session. And that player could look up the number 37 in their document, and it would give them 3 kind of prompt responses for how that could go.
And can you give an example for 37? What would those 3 prompt responses look like?
Oh boy, I have them, but it's been a long time. So yeah, for one of them, I enlist your help on a mission to the silver-blooded giant crab of the Fallow Peaks. 3 responses. 1, we find it clawing at the concrete structure around it, and we allow it to escape. It travels off into the peaks. 2, we find that it has hatched a nest of tiny crabs that respond to us with trust and amazement. Number 3, we find it dying and sit with it, watching through the ice as its eyes close for the final time.
And so this is something that 2 players can send kind of privately in interaction with each other.
Yeah, because with 9 players at the table, is really not, you can't have everyone talking at once. At most, like 3 of them can be talking at once, so it gives the other 6 or something players something to do.
Oh, I really like this concept. I struggle candidly with more than about 5 players to make sure that everyone's having the center stage time they deserve. And this seems like a great way. And gosh, I mean, those possibilities, for that particular prompt, it really does sound like a lot can happen story-wise in the background while I guess someone else is doing the on-stage talking.
Yeah, that's the idea is from a game called Mobile Frame Zero Firebrands, which has solitaire, which is a similar thing, but instead of 2 players, it's like a player can look up their own list of questions in the background.
Interesting. And should we think that there's some like action economy, like you can only do this once per in-game day or anything like that?
No, this is a finale. So this is we're like at this point they already won, and it was about like what do you do after you've won? What does the political situation of the world look like after you've won? And so they can do whatever they want. We're telling a story at this point. The stakes are down.
Right. I mean, if the rebellion is expanding by a factor of 30, 3 times, I guess this is now a pretty big rebellion.
Yes. Like I actually planned to begin like, okay, I need this to like end in a reasonable amount of sessions, and I also need to be like a popular movement by the end. So I think like 30 needs to be the number.
Got it. You didn't want like a vanguard of the proletariat where it's like, good news, 200 people just led the revolution, and now they're imposing it on everyone else.
Yeah. By the end of like hundreds of thousands of areas.
Oh, that's really exciting. Oh, this is such a cool way to run a game. And it sounds like, the systems you're using there, or I guess the system the airship party was using there, I definitely understand how that system lends itself to like building this far-flung, sprawling rebellion that isn't just kind of, here's who we can meet in our local environs or on our day-to-day. It's like you're actually traveling around a lot, and presumably that's how you're getting this huge mass movement.
Mm-hmm.
That makes a ton of sense. Okay, and you had a third system that you wanted to discuss as well that I think also goes in a completely different direction in terms of genre and tropes in those first two.
Yes, this is Clearing Song. This is a grounded, hopeful kid story. It's very much Studio Ghibli inspired, very much about the beauty found in small things and low stakes. In a world of endless sea dotted by floating islands. Some of those islands are populated by humans and others by dragons. Humans and dragons are very different societies. They speak different languages. Humans care a lot about technology and innovation and novelty, and dragons care a lot about mysticism and tradition and law. And they generally don't get along. They don't meet much at all. But there is a group called the Accord that travel in their airships from place to place. And the Accord is made up of both humans and dragons, and they all get along. And they're generally hardy, feared folk, but they are welcome because they sing great songs and smoke sausages and sell meats and hold carnivals. And our story is about some children, some human, some dragon, within the Accord who go on adventures. They fight pirates. They reunite lost lovers. They get girl group bands back together. They defend star-crossed lovers from their families. They adopt whales. This was in a system of the name Clearing Song that used a mechanic called Epillion, called friendship gems. So friendship gems are every character has a virtue that they care very strongly about. So if your virtue is courage, then anytime another player does something that you think is courageous, you can give them a friendship gem. And then you need to spend friendship gems to use your magic move, which is like the thing on your playbook that's special about what your playbook can do.
Right. Okay, and so the story here is more episodic, self-contained, less grand. Here is the fate of the universe, and more. Here is the fate of these like interpersonal relationships that our characters have.
Yes, I had to be very careful to like not get things out of hand. That's the thing I've noticed, is that if you don't keep an eye on the scale can very easily grow and get out of hand. And for some campaigns, that's what you want. But for a lot of campaigns, an increase in scale can mean that it just stops making sense. Like Blood and Velvet, I couldn't let get too big, and Clearing Song also I couldn't get too big. At the end of it, I have to be very confident, like, you are not saving the whales. The whales are fine. The whales might put you and these humans in danger. The whales will be fine, no matter what you do.
Did your players want to save the whales?
They loved the whales, and I knew that, like, if I put on the table, we're trying to save the whales, that would mean there was a possibility they would not save the whales, and the whales would be in danger, and that wouldn't be in genre.
Right. No, I was just about to get to that, because this is, as with the other two campaigns, this one really does have a specific genre in mind. Like, you know what kind of world you want to be in here, and it isn't one where this group of children can somehow save all whales.
Yes.
In this campaign, like, it really is kind of a like children's adventure in a magical world, but honestly, you know, compared to I think a lot of literature and media that's like children's adventure in a fantasy world, the stakes here do actually sound pretty personal and do sound like believable for something that children are accomplishing. You know, it's not, and then they're going to become like the boy kings and queens of the world or anything like that.
No, they're like, one of the things I had to manage was like, I usually don't run campaigns where the player characters are part of some larger group, because it leads to the question of, why doesn't the larger group just bail them out of their problems when they're clearly in over their head, as player characters tend to be? And I had to come up with like a different answer each time for each episode of this. Like sometimes they were kind of going against what their adults wanted to do, or sometimes they got stranded away from the adults and had to survive on their own, or sometimes the adults were doing things wrong and needed to be stopped.
This is a sign you're a much better GM than me, because I love it when my player characters are part of an organization larger than themselves, because that way if I get them into a corner, I can get them out. So I admire your confidence and your ability to keep the story at the right level of peril, I guess.
I think I literally wrote at the end of the Blood and Velvet book, do not have your characters be part of a larger organization, because it could bail them out.
Yeah, wait, does it actually say that?
I believe it does. Like down in the like hacking the settings section way at the bottom. No.
Yes, the one type of group that won't work is a squad within a larger, more powerful organization. The crew will come under direct pressure from their threats that they are not qualified to handle. If they have well-resourced backup to protect them, they won't need to defuse those situations themselves. So I see what you mean. And in this case, there really is, once again, like, there are clear genre expectations, and that does put limits on the kind of story that you can tell, right? Compared to a system that is like epic fantasy or something like that, where like if these children had to go like kill God 50 sessions in, that wouldn't be like completely out of character.
This story was definitely not built for that. As you can tell from like 29 campaigns in 7 years, these are typically pretty short campaigns.
Yes.
I think on average one like 13 sessions of the main actual game. And partly that's like a lot of these are such specific settings and such specific like episode structures that that's how many episodes I can come up with. Like there have been campaigns like I literally cannot think of any more story ideas for this set of characters in this setting. We've run out. But it also means the story can be extremely specific. We're going to tell stories about humans and dragons and romance and whales getting along in this setting. And once we've run out of those stories to tell, the game will be over.
Right, or we're going to tell stories about thieves and curses and heists and gothic cities and things are going to be in that genre.
Yeah,
and you really amplify this by having your own mechanics, or in some cases your whole own entire rule set, right? Because I think a lot of GMs, when they tell these stories, it's like, well, I know what systems my players are familiar with. So can I possibly tell the story I'm interested in just using one of those systems? And it's like, can I tell Star Trek in Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition type questions, which, can you talk a little bit through what led you to build different systems like this?
I guess, as I said at the start, the first system came from, I had this campaign concept that we were all excited about, but I couldn't find a game for it. And that's still basically the case. The way I structure my campaigns is we have our concepting session, our first session 0, where we just come up with what type of story do we want to tell? What's the tone? What's the setting? What's our inspirations, our somatic touchstones? And then we play some world building games to come up to fill out the detailed setting, get on the same page. And sometimes it ends up with a setting that there's a game that makes sense for it. Like it's superheroes. There's so many superhero games out there. I don't need to write one. I can just pick a superhero game and say, it's mecha anime. There's so many mecha animes. But sometimes it's like, I can't find a game that fits this, or the games that fit this are too rules heavy or too dark or too light for exactly what we're trying to do. And in that case, I think it's often just easier just to write one.
And so for every campaign you run, you're having kind of a joint world building session with your players.
Yes. This is something I recommend for, even if you're not going to go through the trouble of designing your own systems, I highly recommend playing world building games like Kingdom, Dialect, For the Queen,
Microscope,
yes. A Quiet Year, that's a great one.
Ooh, yes.
It's just a great idea all the time, because it means that the players will care about the setting, and they'll build characters that belong in the setting, and they'll know the setting. And it's so much easier to engage in your players when the players built characters that have opinions about things in the setting. If you let the players design, like we did a Cyberpunk season recently, I had each of the players design a megacorporation, and then one of the players designed, I'm a robot that escaped from this megacorporation, and I have opinions about the things they're doing. And that makes it so much easier to challenge that player and provide them with content they care about, because you can immediately put things from this megacorporation in front of them, and they'll immediately want to do things about that.
Oh, absolutely. I love this style of collaborative world building. I think that for some GMs and for some tables, the concern is, okay, I have 5 players. We're doing joint world building, joint character creation. Every one of these people fundamentally wants something different, and some of those are mutually incompatible. So it'll be easier for everyone if I, the GM, just iron fist the whole thing and tell them, this is the world, these are the parameters of your characters. And I get what you mean. It might mean that they're less invested, or that they feel like a little mismatched. But on the other hand, you don't have this conflict where different people really just have those fundamentally different visions. I guess I'm curious as how you reconcile that, how you reconcile situations where people show up wanting the world to look different than what the consensus comes out of that world building game.
If we come out of the world building game and different players like aren't happy with the setting, or they have different visions, like someone wants this to be a very dark, heavy, not emotional, but like political game, and someone else wants it to be big and silly, then we'll scrap it and we'll start from scratch. It's just not worth trying to make a campaign work if the players fundamentally want different things out of it. I've done that multiple times.
Can you talk through an example of when that's happened?
Sure. Actually, Clearing Song. Clearing Song began life as like a kind of Pokemon-ish monster hunting, monster capturing game.
Sorry, for the audience, can you clarify which one Clearing Song is?
Clearing Song is the Islands, Studio Ghibli, Humans and Dragons, and the Accord. And Clearing Song started life as like Pokemon were humans who capture and ride dragons. But then we realized we kind of wanted different things from that. Some of them wanted like more fighting with dragons. Some of them wanted more about like your emotional relationship between you and your dragon. And we weren't really feeling it. So we kind of scrapped that and kind of took the ideas we liked, the dragon visuals, and turned into something we were all happy with.
So you stuck with the same players. You didn't say, "Hey, we're a mismatch." You just found something that worked a little.
No, I've not kicked a player out of my group in 6 years. There was once.
Oh wow! And because
it's been mostly the same players for the last 6 years.
Oh wow! I was going to ask whether you'd had dozens of players over time. Do you think that having the same players over and over makes it easier to, inflict a new system on them for some of these campaigns?
Definitely. I mean, partly because these systems are all different, but they're also all powered by the apocalypse, and they're all very much my style. I think the players are quite familiar with my style at this point. I mean, some of these players have never played with a GM other than myself.
Wow.
So, as far as they know, this is what role-playing games are like. In fact, my very first designed game, Scavenger World, was the first role-playing game for 2 of my players.
Oh, wow. Okay, so you got to stop them from ever watching any actual plays on the internet or anything, because they can't learn that there's like these kind of hegemonic standardized systems out there.
I don't know of any such thing.
Oh, okay, good. Neither do I. No, you heard it here, folks. No games exist other than the ones that David has come up with.
I'm not sure. I've played plenty of games other people have designed. I've played Masks and Monster Hearts and The Sprawl. Lots of games.
Okay. No, I mean, I'm being silly. I'm just trying to make sure the episode is safe for your players to listen to. And so these games that you're building do tend to be in a powered by the apocalypse type framework. And we've talked a little bit about those on the show and how they really do excel at capturing specific genres and specific tropes. Is that what kind of draws you to these powered by the apocalypse type systems?
Partly, yes. I mean, they're just, because they are very narrativist, they're very much like, as a player, I'm making decisions because I think it would lead to the most interesting story, not because it's what I think my character would do or it's what would lead to the most mechanically favorable outcomes. And because there's so many of them, they're so genre specific and they tend to encode the genre in their rules. I find they are, I really like them. That's why I run them. But I think the core loop of Power by the Apocalypse, which is like the players direct the action. The GM says, "What do you do?" The players say, "I try to do this." They roll if applicable, and if it's a partial success or a failure, and partial success is the most likely option, the GM gets to complicate the story. It immediately leads to that kind of TV show, comic book, back and forth, very like camera's always on the protagonist. Like Indiana Jones says, "I'm going to try to swap a bag of sand for the idol." Roll. That's a partial success. You get the idol, but then a giant boulder comes down. You have to run away from it. I'm going to get out of the temple as fast as I can. Rolls. That's a failure. And James like, "Okay, you get out by the skin of your teeth." And then you hear a familiar voice saying, "Mr. Jones, how kind of you to bring this to me." It's like that to me, like I try to do something and it goes well or it goes badly. It's like very immediate and useful.
Absolutely. And I think, the difficulty some people have with that sort of game is it does require a certain rapport with your players, where they trust you and they're willing to roll with you on what those complications look like. But in your case, you've played with these people long enough that that's really not a concern at all.
Yeah, I think one thing I like and notice now that I'm looking at non-Powered by the Apocalypse systems is that a lot of times those systems tend to provide rules for what the GM can and can't do. Like the GM can only act on their turn, and the GM can only introduce this kind of harm if they've like foreshadowed this way. And Powered by the Apocalypse games are very free. Like on the GM, when it's your opportunity to complicate their lives, do whatever you want. There is no limitations to what you could do. You could theoretically say, yeah, Indiana Jones, you rolled a failure, so you get crushed by the boulder and die. But they rely on like the GM to have an understanding of what a good story looks like.
Right. This is close to that OSR, like GMs make rulings, they don't follow rules type guideline almost.
Kind of. OSR PBT are kind of like convergent evolution in a way. And then like they're trying to accomplish very different things, but they ended up with a lot of the same techniques. Like in both of these types of systems, sometimes the player will do something and the GM will say, oh yeah, you don't roll for that. That just happens.
Yes.
But it's for very different reasons. In OSR, it's trying to reward players for having clever solutions. You're rewarded by not having to roll dice. And Powered by the Apocalypse, it's like, yeah, I think as a storyteller, you failing that wouldn't be very interesting. It wouldn't be very interesting if you just failed to get to the place where the adventure was happening, so let's just say you get there.
I really like that distinction between one of them is rewarding the players for being clever problem solvers, and the other is kind of rewarding players for being clever storytellers.
Yeah, or rather working together with the players to tell the stories that we all want to tell.
Right. As opposed to working together to avoid having to go into the dungeon or something. No, I think that's a really helpful distinction. It sounds like you also have imported some mechanics at the very least from outside of Powered by the Apocalypse type systems. Let's talk more about this corkboard because I think this is such a cool concept.
Sure. This is a... so like once again, I got this straight from a game called Noirlandia, which is also a great game. Highly recommended.
All the games you've been referencing, we will link to in the show notes because... I think a lot of our audience there's a discoverability issue, I'll put it that way, with TTRPGs beyond the really obvious ones.
Oh yes.
And so we'll definitely link to Noirlandia and everything else you've mentioned in the show notes.
I've had it fun, like, okay, we're gonna play this game for world building. This game has never been released, but it was played on an actual play podcast once, and I kind of reverse engineered the rules from that.
What game was that?
That was The Tower by Austin Walker and Jack DeKeat. It's a game for exactly 2 players about a god and a pilgrim.
Okay, we might not link to that one in the show notes, but I'll do my best to find it.
You cannot. It has never been released, and it never will be released.
Oh my god, okay. Sorry?
What about the actual play?
Oh yeah, Riley asks, what about the actual play? We should probably link to that.
The actual play is Friends at the Table, run by Austin Walker, the co-designer of the game.
Oh, it's an episode of Friends at the Table. Oh yeah, we'll absolutely link to that in the show notes then.
Yes.
Sorry, back to the corkboard.
Yes.
Let's talk through this mechanic because I think this is a cool example of something that isn't really PBTA inspired, but works super well in the setting that you're playing in.
Yeah. So this is the way it works is the corkboard contains leads and connections between leads, and these are, as are much in kind of narrativist games, these are both mechanical and flavorful. So if you discover a connection during a mission, like you find out that these 2 things are related, you immediately get a connection between those 2 leads because it represents that. But also there are moves that specifically tell you draw a connection between 2 leads, and when you do that, you have to describe, well, what is that connection?
Right. And continue.
Like you start, and there are also some kind of making it into a game rather than just like a thing you're building out, representing a mystery. There are assets. Those are leads that are kind of on your side and you can take advantage of. Blood and Velvet is a unique game in that your character never gets stronger. Your character does not level up. They do not earn experience. They can get worse. They can take scars, and if they take too many scars, they will die. But they cannot get stronger because noir characters don't get stronger. They just get more scarred. But you can get assets. Assets can help you to a certain degree with missions. And then there are threats. Threats are leads that are on the board that have a ticking clock on them. And when that clock ticks over, that threat will do something bad to you directly. They represent all the people and all the groups that are suspicious of you and or want things you have because you're tangled up in this mystery. And your main incentive to create leads and string connections is that when you start a mission, you name which lead you would like to target. So first of all, you can't even go after someone if you don't have them as a lead. And then your engagement roll, the roll that determines how well you start out the mission, is based on how many connections you have to the lead you are targeting. So you want to learn as much about your target as possible before you go after them.
Got it. And then how does this ultimately tell you who the what the solution to the mystery, or I guess resolve the overall web?
So in Norlandia, you kind of like, once you have a certain number of leads, you kind of turn them into an answer to the mystery. For this one, I kind of like, whenever you perform, at the end of a mission, if it turns out that mission was relevant to the mystery, you draw a lead between the thing you target in that mission and the mystery, which is kind of like a central lead at the top of the board that kind of you connect back to. And once you have 3 leads connected to the mystery, then you can solve the mystery. And what that looks like is the GM and the players all sit down and they look at all the stuff they've found so far and they go, gosh, what happened? And that's what the collaborative process. Once again, it's not just the GM. Everyone talks together like this. I guess this makes sense. Once you have this much stuff on the table, at this point you probably have like, I don't know, 15 things on the corkboard. You kind of immediately think, well, it probably was them doing it for that, and that was the reason that happened. And then you kind of like, it usually kind of falls out until there's one answer that makes the most sense, and that's the answer to the mystery.
Very cool. Although one thing about this kind of game that I think is, different from people's TTRPG expectation is that you're not solely inhabiting a character, right? You're also kind of stepping out of the shoes of the character and doing some additional storytelling about things that character could not possibly know.
Oh yeah,
right.
I mean, that's typical Powered by Apocalypse stuff. I mean, I think original Apocalypse World said, ask questions and use the answers. And so you just go to a player and say like, who would you least like to see at this party? And then the player like comes up with a character, and that character is there.
Right, and I'm thinking about like in Dungeon World, right? One of the moves a bard has is when you show up in a new city, you know something about it, and that thing is true.
Yep, absolutely.
But those are very that kind of example is very baked in, where it can be communicated or said in character, right? Compared to something like resolving these mysteries, which fundamentally they're going to be describing things that happened in the past, almost out of character. I guess, how do you keep people playing, thinking about themselves? Okay, I'm having this character, but I'm also telling some kind of story about things that are happening very far from my character.
I find that players are actually pretty amenable to that. I mean, if they're engaged and they're paying attention, they care about the story and the other characters in the world, they'll already have suspicions. They'll already have ideas. And it's not that hard, because when you were solving the mystery, the idea is we solve the mystery at the moment that the players figure out what happened.
Right.
So we're kind of also describing and this is probably how I know that from what I just found in this mission.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay. I'd love to talk with you, and I think we can focus on Blood and Velvet for this part in particular. I'd love to chat a little bit about mechanics, right? And to get a little bit more crunchy. Off mic beforehand, you said you like to break down mechanics into agenda, resources, moves, and characters. And let's start with agenda.
So yeah, the agenda this is by terminology directly from Apocalypse World. The agenda is a game's reason for being. The point of the game, the thing you're trying to do with the game. So for Blood and Velvet, I knew from the start, Gothic, occult, noir. This is the type of story I want to tell. I want to tell a story about knowledge and secrecy. And eventually that turned into 3 goals. Make the city corrupt, classy, and discreet. Fill the characters' lives with tension. And 3, play to find out what happens. Play to find out what happens is kind of like a Power by the Apocalypse mantra. It shows up in a lot of games. And your agenda is your guiding star. For the rest of design, whenever you're thinking, should I use this mechanic or that mechanic? They're both perfectly functional mechanics. You go back to your agenda. Which one best produces the agenda that I'm looking for? I was about to say that like there's kind of a step in between coming up with the agenda and coming up with the resources, which is read a whole bunch of games. Find a whole bunch of games that are similar to the kind of thing you're trying to do, and read them. You don't typically need to read the whole thing, but you can download like just the player aids, the stuff that players would print out and have at the table, the GM aids, and that usually contains the main mechanic of the system, the stuff that you'd like might actually be transplantable to a different system. I remember just like before Scavenger World, my first game, just having like 20 tabs open and going through like copying down every mechanic I thought was interesting.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I guess you ended up using a lot of those because that first system drew so heavily from Scavenger World.
From Apocalypse World, yes.
From Apocalypse World. My apologies. The system was Scavenger World. Yes. And so when we think about the player characters, how does that inform the agenda that they have? When the players come to the table.
Yeah, some games like to write like an agenda for the players too, like what the players are meant to do. I typically don't write those, although I think they can often be a good idea. I think the agenda is also it's meant for all players. We're all trying to make the city feel corrupt, classy, and discreet. We're all trying to fill the lives with tension. And that's part of like why the world building and concepting is so important to this. That's where you all get all the players on the same page, and once you've all like built the world together, you'll start to sync. If that works, you have a common understanding of what type of story you're trying to tell. You need to put that into words so you can start designing from it.
Right. Having that initial buy-in is for games that work like this. Having that initial buy-in is crucial. We've definitely had guests who come into their campaign saying, I have a story I want to tell. I'm going to build an elaborate world that is designed around that story, and my players had better make characters and will be strongly encouraged to make actions that help tell that story that I would love to tell, which is a very different philosophy than what you've gone with here.
Yeah, for me, buy-in is the most important thing, whether it's a game I'm making or a game I found. If the players are all on the same page, we all want to tell the same story, we're all excited, it'll be a good campaign. I've had campaigns in games that I've ended up really not liking. By the end of the campaign, we were basically not even using the game. We were just kind of like, roll dice and we'll kind of figure out what it means. Didn't matter. We all wanted to tell the same story. And so it just worked. And I've had games or campaigns in games that I really like and respect, but the players and we're not all on the same page. We want different things, and the whole thing just kind of falls flat. That's the most important thing for a successful campaign.
And it's interesting that even when you're all on the same page on what kind of story you want to tell, and you're all working together to tell that story, you are still rolling dice.
Well, yes, part of the story we want to tell is that we want to be surprised. We want the story to go in unusual directions.
Okay, so you have the story you want to tell in terms of the flavor and the setting and the themes, but you don't really have an ending in mind that you would find like collectively you would find satisfying.
Yeah, sorry. When I say the story we want to tell, I always mean like this is the tone we want. This is the type of story we want. We want to tell this type of story, but we don't want to know the ending.
Got it. And so I guess this is a big advantage in having your own system, right? Because if you want to tell a light and funny story, or a story with a sense of wonder where you're all human and dragon children flying around in an airship saving whales, you don't want a succession of bad dice rolls to lead to a player character dying horribly.
Yes, I've had games where characters just can't die. I think yes. I had a very melodramatic mecha anime game called Dress Dynamic, which literally characters could not die. If you defeated a bad guy, you kind of got to choose between four options. Like you captured them, or you impressed them, or you got them to run away in fear. But none of those options were kill them. So that meant that like NPCs that you beat in one episode would keep coming back and developing lore and relationships, because that was the kind of story it was meant to be.
Right, and the mechanics have kind of gated away accidentally telling the wrong story from a bunch of bad dice rolls.
Yes. I think in general, like that's just, no matter what game you're playing, it's a good GM advice. Like you don't point guns you're not willing to shoot. If you put on the table, the stakes of this episode are, will we conquer the flagship? That means you're opening the possibility of not conquering the flagship. And if you're not willing to open that possibility, you need to structure that session differently.
Right. And if at some point, if your players keep coming to sessions where the stakes are, can we conquer the flagship? And the answer is always yes, this is an unqualified success. It stops feeling quite as much like, oh, we're all playing a game together, and more like everyone is sitting here listening to me tell a story to them.
Yeah, I mean, there are types of stories that are like that. Like if you're telling a superhero story, superheroes almost never lose. That's not really what superhero stories are about. It's often about the cost of victory. And so you might have like, it's not a question of will you defeat Eclipse and the army of transdimensional eclipses. It's will doing so finally break up the tenuous relationship between you and your patron who doesn't like the way you've been going about things. It's like you have to, what are the stakes of this session, of this scene? And the stakes have to be things you're willing to see go both ways, or else why have them be stakes?
I think that's a really reasonable way to think of it. And to what extent do you select the player's move sets, or I guess their range of available actions to fit into the mood and into the stakes in the same way?
Yeah, we're kind of jumping around. We're kind of jumping over like resources into moves.
Oh shoot! Yeah, let's go back and talk about resources. My apologies.
Yeah. No problem. Like where the conversation went. Yeah, these are kind of very connected things, resources and moves. But I find it most interesting to think of, or most easiest rather. First thing about what are the resources, the mechanics, the things that you put on your character sheet that can go up and down. So if these are like a big opportunity to say what matters in this setting. For example, in most games, your characters might get punched in the face, and presumably something should happen when they get punched in the face. So you're going to want a harm mechanic. But what kind of harm makes sense? Is this the kind of harm that isn't very painful in the moment, but it's expensive to heal later? Maybe that's like a cyberpunk thing. Cyberpunk is all about money and scarcity.
Yes.
Or maybe getting punched, it makes you worse at doing things. So maybe just think about other options. That's like a heist thing. Heists are all about, the plan we had for doing this, which you'd normally be very good at, it fell through. So now I have to think about doing things another, even more convoluted way. Maybe you want harm that just like, it just kind of builds up and doesn't do anything until it maxes out, and then it's catastrophic. It's like superheroes. It's like you determine what's the kind of harm I want. What's the kind of, do I need a mechanic for information? Blood and Velvet is a game about solving a mystery. So there's a resource called clues
yes.
to represent you gathered information during this mission, and later on we'll figure out what that information was. Because information is so important to that kind of setting. Perennials Mayhem had support, as I said. Like there's this thing representing how much do people like the rebellion? How much are you impressing people, building support, recruiting people? Clearing Song had friendship gems, because friendship is an important concept. I want the mechanics to represent friendship. Do you want a money mechanic? Do you want an experience mechanic? Do you want like a chi internal resolve, stick-to-itness determination mechanic?
Wait, why do you consider that to be cheap?
Chi, sorry, QI, chi.
Oh, my apologies. I thought you said a cheap mechanic. I'm like, that actually...
No, sorry. Chi isn't the thing that wuxia martial artists have.
Yes. That makes more sense. Yeah, I mean, I think with a lot of these resources, we are going to be informed by the media we consume and by things like video games, where there are a lot of currencies or a lot of resources that manifest primarily externally, right? Like the amount of money we have, the amount of spells we can cast, the number of arrows we have, something like that. But it sounds like in the games that you run, they're frequently also more internal, like these friendship gems.
Yeah, I mean, if you were running a game about like crawling around in a dungeon and one arrow matters, then yes, arrows should be a resource in your game. But if you're telling a game about like being like humans and dragons on a Studio Ghibli adventure, then we're not tracking gear at all.
Right.
We're not tracking money at all, because those things are not important to this kind of story.
To what extent do you iron out before your campaign starts what kind of resources and how resource intensive things are going to be with your players?
Usually I don't have players participating in the nitty-gritty of the design process.
Got it.
Mainly for scheduling reasons.
Big mood.
I don't have a lot of time to make these games, so I don't really have time to like shop them around with players before I show them to them. I think generally my players are not that interested in like very resource-heavy, resource management, dungeon crawly, Heart or Spire type games. So I think it's generally like there's like between 3 and 5 core resources to the game, some of which are like applicable on like a scene by scene level, some on like a session by session level, some of them are more persistent between sessions.
That sounds like a reasonable number of resources to keep track of. In a campaign I'm running right now, I introduced the mechanic that my players would have to worry about having enough food for their travels. And it turned out that they didn't really care much about like, oh no, how are we going to find food? They did care about the quality of the food. And so they amongst themselves have invented new mechanics for how like well seasoned the food is, and consider themselves to have separate amounts of lousy rations and good rations. And I've been positively impressed, but I realized that it sounds like your players are very different from that in terms of how thrilled they are by having some more spreadsheets.
Yeah, very, very low spreadsheet, this group, or one of these groups. The other group, I think, could do a more resource-intensive game. I just haven't done one with them yet.
That's entirely reasonable. And so I think that, given that you do have a different system for every campaign you run, I guess you do have that flexibility to say, hey, this group is going to have a resource-like game, and this group will be tracking things intensively from week to week.
Yeah. I think one group, I don't think either group really wants to like track resources and care about resources. I think partly because they don't trust me to like, part of like having a resource heavy game, they're like, you have to say that you're willing to make your players miserable if they don't respect this stuff.
Yes.
Like if you don't keep your resources, you're going to starve. And we're going to have just like a really slow session where we care about getting one item of food. And maybe that's interesting if you're interested in kind of survival story. I think my players know me well enough to know that I'm not interested in that kind of story. And so if they ever got to that, I would probably just bail them out because I don't want to tell that story.
That's reasonable. It does slow things down. I think for me, that kind of thing is more about prompting them to think and plan things out before heading out into the wilderness. And I do it with kind of a tacit expectation that they'll always have prepared enough that it will never come up as an issue. Because your point is well taken. It's probably not that interesting to spend a whole session narrating looking for berries.
I mean, I think there's you can find plenty of examples of stories of people like searching for like one item of food. And that's like that one item of food suddenly becomes the whole focus of the story. That could be really interesting. We have our whole story. We need to kill this one bird. It's the only thing in this area that we could probably catch and kill. And like, with no resource to our name, how do we kill this bird? That could be an interesting session if that's the kind of campaign you're doing.
Yeah, point well taken. I think that my players would zone out pretty quickly at that point. But you're right. There are people out there who really want the survival tropes in their game. Yeah. And I think this conversation has kind of prompted me to think about like how would you design a system that really prioritized for example, constantly scrabbling to survive.
I think like that's a lot of the classic dungeon crawl games are like that. For as much as I haven't run any of them. That's when people pitch like what is appealing about OSR type games. It's often that kind of thing.
Yeah, that point is well taken. I mean, I think a lot of the time OSR games they want you to worry about surviving, but then they do just kill you for no reason.
Yes. Look, I'm not saying I understand. I haven't played any.
Yeah, we actually, yeah. I don't think that they're what my players would be interested in playing, but that's because, and I guess it's something I'm curious as how you handle at your table. My players, and I think a lot of people I've played with in the past, love rules lawyering. They love finding a situation where the GM has said, okay, given that rule and given what we know about the world, here's what the outcome is. And they love saying, no, that would not be the outcome, and litigating that fairly intensively. It sounds like you're maybe less interested in doing that with your players, and these are systems that hold less of that as a possibility.
Yeah, combination of both. One thing, if I designed the system, it's hard for the players to argue with me about like what I meant by those moves. I try to write them fairly clearly.
Yeah, point taken.
And partly, like, sometimes, like, when players do find things that I've written that, like, oh yeah, that is what that says, I try to go along with them. Like, a player will find something like, boy, that move really does say at any time, or that move really does not specify a maximum size on things you can move with it. And like, sure, absolutely. you can absolutely destroy the entire island with that move. It says destroy anything, simply and utterly. The island is a thing. Absolutely. Well, what are the consequences of that? That can be fun. Like, I try to go by the letter of the law once I'm done writing down the law. But I don't think, in terms of like, I think the type of rules lawyering that's least interesting to me is like the very mechanical, like, can I choose to apply this modifier after I've rolled instead of before it? Or does this count as a that for the purpose of that getting me an additional +1? That is not interesting to me, and I just generally try not to write rules that invite that kind of rules lawyering.
I think that's entirely reasonable. I know of a table where they love the gritty realism of how far could you see someone, because the spell has line of sight as its range, but what's the curvature of this planet? And how absorptive and refractive is the atmosphere? And I think that's I think at that point it's like a very fun physics word problem if you're teaching first year physics, but probably not what I would consider gameplay anymore.
No, I do all, like, one of my common things, like, if I want to describe like a really impactful move, I'll do like, okay, the camera cuts away to a wide shot so we can see like the huge devastation of that attack. Or like we cut to another character and we just hear the giant boom of whatever it is you just did. Sometimes like it's like I very much operate by TV show, by movie logic a lot of the time.
Right, because when we're telling these stories, we are thinking about how that would look cinematically, I think, and so it's pretty natural to talk about where the camera's looking.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit more about moves then, because it does sound like you do endow some of your player characters with really destructive moves, and then others with kind of fun, cuddly moves.
Yeah, I mean, like, okay, kind of there's moves in two parts. There's like the moves available to everyone. That's like that's the thing you come up with first. It's very important to do the moves that get a game that works with but character-specific stuff first, and then you move on to like character-specific moves, which I like having them being destructive sometimes. I think that's fun. But firstly, like you said, like, do you restrict what players can do to match the setting of the story? And it's a bit of both. You don't really restrict what players can do, but you restrict what the game cares about. Like, Clearing Song, the Humans and Dragons and Studio Ghibli game, it's a game about kids, the kids show. And so it has a move for stand up to authority. Whenever you tell a grown-up that what they're doing is wrong and here's what they should do, there's a specific move for that. The game checks for that. It says, okay, when you do that, we roll dice. We have specific options outlined. Where in most games, when you do that, maybe we go to a generic move, or maybe like they just say no because they have no reason to listen to you. In Perennial Ultimatum, there was specific moves for like, because the world is magic. There's a magic move available to everyone where you spend magic points to just ask the earth for a favor, and you usually get it, but often more than you bargained for. And that's an example of like a thing that you kind of can't do in most settings, but is important to this setting.
And in this setting, anyone can do that.
Yes. Like that's like, you are fairies, you have this connection to this world and to magic, to the bloom, it was called.
Ooh, I love that. And so at any point, that really works well with the genre that you're in. Because at any point, any of your characters can potentially do something that's excessive or sweeping or as you said, more than they bargained for.
Yeah. And like generally, like with moves, you want moves for fighting, and you want moves for talking to people, and you want moves for finding things out.
Yes.
And different games will want different amounts of these things. This is also like, once you have your resources, that helps you for your moves, because you want moves that will allow you to get all of these resources. For example,
right. Or lower your opponent's resources.
Yeah, if opponents have resources, which sometimes they do. For example, like, if you're running a game that has strings are a mechanic from Monster Hearts that represent emotional hold that you have over other people. And in Monster Hearts, the move you use to get strings on people is turn someone on. That immediately says, this is a game about teenage supernatural romance, about being horny and unsure and queer. And if you have strings, you're ready to move like, well, how do you get emotional hold over people? That kind of specifies what your moves are. And if you don't have a move or something, that kind of says, this game doesn't care about that. that kind of wuxia martial arts fancy game, it didn't have moves for like sneaking around or solving problems because it's a martial arts, like especially battle anime.
Yes.
Everything should funnel into combat. There shouldn't be moves for avoiding combat because people don't avoid combat in this type of story. If you try to avoid combat, it just won't work.
Right. And you don't want, like, players are going into that game, presumably they're not thinking, how am I going to get out of ever doing combat?
Yes, no, you didn't go, like, because we all talk about, like, this is a battle anime, we're all building, like, our cool martial artist characters with 5 names.
Right. And so let's talk about the other kind of move, the really specific kind that is maybe player or class specific.
Yeah, so Apocalypse World kind of set out the standard for how Powered by Apocalypse games handle playbooks, what some games called classes, and it's been such a good formula, basically everyone just follows it. So every playbook comes with a name and a description, that's kind of very flavorful and short, and then some character creation process or rules or moves, and then there's the core mechanic of the playbook, the thing that only that playbook can do. So in Perennial Ultimatum, one of the playbooks was the Oath Mage. So we like the idea of fairies, one of the facings, making contracts with people. So the Oath Mage can make binding contracts. That's their core mechanic that only they can do, and it's central to everything they do. Whenever someone makes a promise to you, you may spend 1 magic. If you do, the promise becomes binding, and binding promises can never be broken.
Ooh.
And like the core mechanic is something like very powerful and flavorful and specific to that playbook. And then you also have a bunch of optional level up moves. You take 1 when you take the playbook, when you start, and then you can take 1 each time you level up, or take 1 or do something else. And once or twice per character for campaign, you can take an optional move from another playbook, and that lets you like have weird combinations of moves and make your character very distinct, while not letting you just like be kind of between playbooks. The point of playbooks is to point players towards archetypal characters of this kind of story. So you don't want players like shopping around too much.
Right. Although it does take a certain type of player because, you know, these classes or these playbooks, these really powerful moves, like that Oath Mage example you gave is ludicrously powerful, right? You can make any promise binding forever. Mm-hmm. And so it starts to suggest, I guess, min-maxed or optimized player actions that don't necessarily further the narrative very effectively.
I suppose. Like that's an example of the kind of move I like being powerful, in that it's powerful, but not in a way that like it gets you +3 on all your rolls. It's powerful in a way that
sure,
if you're creative, you can come up with ways to make it powerful. You have to make them say the promise before you make it binding. So like, are you going to put people under duress? Are you going to trick people? And also, the most powerful ways of using this move have the potential to go bad in really complicated, destructive ways. You ask someone to do this one thing at the expense of all else, and now they're unable to feed themselves or something. Note that move does not give you a way to undo promises.
No, absolutely. I'm nodding vigorously. I think this is a very cool move. I think it's this kind of playbook can also suggest that the player do the same thing in every situation to some extent if those rules or if those moves are very powerful.
Oh yes, I've definitely had circumstances like, wow, this move ended up being more powerful than I thought, like especially destructive moves. I like playbooks with like very powerful, very destructive moves but at some great cost conceptually. But like I've had campaigns like, wow, you're using that a lot. So I was thinking, well, what's the consequence for that? And I don't want to take away that you can do the powerful thing. So I'd be like, well, the people traveling with you don't like the wanton murder, and they stage intervention. They talk to you, hey, we're not going to have to work with you if you keep doing this kind of thing, because it could have just as easily been us. Like you hired us, they hired them. That could have just been us. We're not going to help you with this for as long as you're doing that. If they don't care, introduce them to people who do.
I think there's no greater encapsulation than like of the modern TTRPG experience than like the party having an intervention to stop the murders.
Yeah. Like I was like, one thing I'm not concerned about at all between these playbooks is balance. I think it might be my players or might be just players in general. I don't think players care about balance that much, especially for a game they're just finding. Like if this is a game's been out for 30 years and everyone knows that, I don't know, this playbook sucks, then players are going to come into that playbook having a chip on their shoulder, like, oh, I had to play playbook that sucks. But there's a game out there called Worldwide Wrestling, which is like a pro wrestling game. It's also powered by the Apocalypse. And there's a playbook in it called The Jobber. And the Jobber's gimmick is that they lose all their matches. They are 100% booked to lose. And every time I've run Worldwide Wrestling, there's been a player who's been super excited to play The Jobber. They can't wait to have the most pathetic wrestler you've ever seen in your life. And players love playing characters that are vulnerable and weak and helpless, as long as they can advance the narrative and be a part of the story while still being weak and helpless.
That's a really important distinction to make, I think. And so many campaigns, I think, naturally lend themselves to the way you have narrative impact has a lot to do with either you've done violence or you're able to make a credible threat of violence. And so it maybe skews players towards choosing powerful characters. But in like a WWE world, that's maybe less of a consideration.
Yeah, I mean, on a World Wrestling's a little different because it's kind of a PvP game in a weird way. It's a cool game, but one type of playbook I love introducing is character that is not that powerful, has to rely on people, but is fundamentally right and fighting for what's right. Often they're the defender of some safe and good place in this world. And because they are in the right and because they are trying to do the right thing, they can't be too powerful. We need to force them to go out and rely on people who have ulterior motives to complicate their story. But they have narrative power in a certain sense of people want them to succeed.
I really like that, and it's maybe more satisfying for a joint storytelling game to not have, we'll just give the PCs the maximum possible power and let them figure things out.
Yeah. I do have players that like optimizing, and they do some optimizing. The struggle with optimizing, this is basically true of all game design, not just tabletop game design, is to make the players who are optimizing kind of point them towards the fun thing, the thing that's fun for them and also fun for everyone else.
Right. It's not, I have one powerful spell, I can do it an unlimited number of times, and when I walk into a room, I'm thinking about who I'm casting that spell on.
Yeah.
I guess when you're building these systems, how do you approach, okay, here are the set of options you can have when you build a character. Here are your playbooks, or here are the other, enumerated character attributes.
Yeah, so typically you choose a playbook, and then the playbook has some options for stats, and you pick your starting move from the optional moves, and then there's a bunch of stuff that's not mechanical, like there's some questions that you get asked if you choose this character, kind of to fill out your background. I like to give each playbook different options from your eyes, or you have bright eyes, shining eyes, dull eyes, fearful eyes, blank eyes, and again, just inspire what your character looks like. It's not Powered by Apocalypse games in general, not big on hugely customizable characters. You pick your playbook, your starting move, your stat distribution, but there's typically one stat you really want to be good if you're using this playbook, and that's about it. I did have one game called Nightmare High, which was kind of a teenage psychological horror game where you picked two playbooks. You picked a clique, that's your identity as a student, so you're the overachiever or the jock or the geek, and you also picked an origin. That's the moment when the nightmare crossed paths with your life. So you might be the chosen one, or might be the adopted. You have a strange backstory that your parents don't tell you about. And you can combine any one of these two lists.
Right, and I guess for genres where the media that's inspiring the tropes is rich enough, you can kind of combine those two lists and always think, well, I actually have an archetype in mind that combines those two.
Yeah, there were some obvious combinations, like you're the geek, but you're probably the know-it-all. But you don't have to be. You could be the geek and be the chosen one.
Oh, I'm trying to think of media where the geek is the chosen one.
I know. Blanking for me.
That's a tough combination. I guess there was an era when Spider-Man was a geek, but that's a long time ago now.
And this is very much chosen one in the didn't ask to be chosen, like psychological horror. Like the Chosen One's mechanic was at the beginning of each session, you roll a 6-sided die, and each number has a result for what kind of vision you have, and your vision will come true.
Oh no!
Like on a 6, you have a vision of success. On a 3, you have a vision of risk. On a 1, you have a vision of tragedy.
And then that's this session going to come true.
It will come true, yes.
Oh boy. Hate it when I get those visions. Yeah, so, and I guess with that, I guess I'm curious as to what kind of, as with any kind of foretelling the future type, rules, I guess I'm curious as to what kind of role play that encourages in the character.
Okay, no one ended up picking that playbook, but I have had moves like that in various games. There's a very nice move like that from The Heart, which is a different role-playing game that I didn't design. Generally, as long as you as with prophecies in any type of story, as long as you're vague enough about them, it can be very fun to as long as you're keeping open, it could still be in a good way or a bad way. It can be very fun to introduce them to the story in a way that feels natural. And because you're the GM and you have a lot of power over where the story goes, you almost always can introduce them in a way that feels powerful. And especially, usually you let the player decide what the vision is, because then you get your cool prophecy tropes of the player sees something they think is a good omen, but it turns out it was actually a trick or a bad omen in some way, and vice versa, because those are
right.
The classic things that happen with prophecies.
Right. Prophecies do need some amount of ambiguity in a role-playing game, or else you've just kind of...
Yeah. But also, in any story, when the prophecy seems to be a good thing, it's almost always a bad thing. When it seems to be a bad thing, it's, okay, sometimes all still a bad thing, but sometimes a good thing.
Sure. I mean, I don't know if that's always the case, but definitely in a Powered by the Apocalypse type setting, I would expect it to be complicated more than you initially thought.
That's the hope.
Sorry?
That's the hope.
Yeah. So, do you have any thoughts, I guess, for people who are looking to build systems for their own campaigns, right? And they're tired of using the same system over and over, and they want to get started in the direction you've gone. Do you have any advice for them, or any kind of ideas how they might get started in doing so?
Sure. First, steal. Steal relentlessly. You're not going to publish this thing. No one's going to accuse you of plagiarism. Go through all your favorite games that you like, games you've ever played, games that are close. Just copy stuff. If you like the wording of a move or a mechanic, just copy that wording, word for word. No one's going to stop you. Almost all my games are they're taking mechanics directly from other games. Published designers do it all the time. There's no shame about it. Second, be willing to go back on your ideas. Be willing to revise. There have been plenty of games where I'm 1 or 2 sessions in and I immediately know this is not working. And then you can just take that mechanic out of the game, replace it with something else. The first session of the city side of the Fairy Rebellion game Perennial Ultimatum had this mechanic called factions, where there were 12 factions in the city, and they each had an opinion of you, and you had to make them go up and down, and if you worked with factions, you could put them in danger. It didn't work at all. Players hated it. No one had any fun. It was very fiddly. So after that first session, I just tore that out, replaced it with something much simpler. I find usually when you start out the game fairly with all the ideas you think might work, and then when they don't work, you take them out. The game almost always gets simpler over time. I mean, that's true about games that you didn't design. Almost always will be mechanics that you don't use for whatever reason. They kind of fall into disuse, and they essentially stop being part of the game because you're not using them.
I'm confused. Is not everyone using coin weight in their game still?
Yeah, exactly. And certainly when writing rules, the structure of a rule is when or whenever or at or on situation, thing that happens. And then thing that happens includes choices you make, costs you have to pay, dice you roll, and what happens when you roll those dice. Do not write rules you can clear your dishonor at most 1 per session at the end of a session if you fulfilled your obligation. Instead, write, at the end of each session, if you fulfilled your obligation, you may clear 1 dishonor. because that puts the most important part of the rule, which is when the player needs to care about it, at the start of the rule, so they can just, while scanning the list of rules, like, oh, these are all the moves that take place at the end of each session, and then they can look to see if they apply.
So there's really a technical writing component to what you're doing as well.
Yes, you do have to learn how to like write with a fair amount of precision. Templates like choose one, and then a list of bulleted options, or choose one or more, or choose up to two, are useful, as are whenever X, if Y, do Z, otherwise Q. Like those kinds of frameworks make things clear.
And in your experience, do you go back and revise the rules for clarity once the players have had a chance to see them?
Usually not. If I revise rules, it's usually because they're not working, or they're not. Yeah, basically they're not working. Either their players aren't using them, or they're resulting in weird outcomes, or they're repetitive, or whatever. I think only once have I revised a rule because it was too powerful. Wait, what
was that rule?
This was in the Noble House of Wands. This is our wuxia martial arts game, and there was one playbook called The Student, and one of the student starting move options was chosen one of the flaming art or something, which is you are the heir to some incredible martial art. Basically, you can go Super Saiyan. This is the game where you spend chi points, QI points, whenever you roll. That determines how many dice you roll. There are no stats, there's only chi. And the student has, when you spend at least 3 chi, double the amount of dice you roll.
Oh no.
Because the idea is you go Super Saiyan and you do something, when you go big, you go extremely big. And it turned out it was a little too easy to go like just big enough to trigger the move. So I ended up like flattening that curve a little.
And did it work better after you made it hard to trigger?
Yeah, it stopped being kind of like a guaranteed win button so often.
That sounds absolutely crucial. Yeah, this I guess in putting together the games, do you have any, I guess, tools or any resources that people can think of as like, hey, once I actually am ready to start writing something, here's how I would go about putting it together in a way that other people could access and comprehend?
I mean, like Blood and Velvet, I typed up nice as a book, but mostly the games, they're like, we're all online, my campaigns, and so it's all in one shared Google Doc, and at the top of the Google Doc will end up just like writing out the moves, just like plain text in a table. It doesn't take much. You don't need to write a ton. You need to write basically the thing that you'd hand to the player at the table if you were playing in person, which typically is like one sheet of paper double-sided containing all the rules of the game, and then one sheet of paper double-sided, that's their character sheet. And then a different character sheet for each playbook. All the other moves that would go in whatever 200-page book this game would be, those rules are intended for the game master. They're meant to give advice to the game master. But you don't need to give advice to yourself. You already know what advice you give to yourself.
That's entirely reasonable. Yeah, I mean, I will say the rules for Blood and Velvet are like nicely typeset. Like this is a really navigable book. But I guess if you're only going to play with your own table, you don't need to worry about that as much.
Yeah, still group the moves, like the rules in a logical way. Start with like the general mechanics of the game, and then go on to like specific things, kind of grouped by what situation you use, and put all the social moves together, stuff like that. That's typically pretty obvious.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The next question, oh boy, I think this is going to be one where we're going to have to talk about maybe one specific campaign, like Blood and Velvet. What is some media, or I guess, what were you reading or watching or listening to that inspired putting together, let's say Blood and Velvet, the rule set, and the campaign?
Blood and Velvet? So the biggest tonal inspiration for that game is Fallen London by Fail Better Games.
Yes!
Yes, it's very Fallen London. Fallen London has the best writing in all of video games. It is unfortunately not a very good game, right, but it does have amazing writing. It's this kind of Gothic London that is sunk beneath the earth and has just the most beautiful writing in all of video games. There's a little bit of Darkest Dungeon, the video game by Red Hook Games, in there. There's a little bit of Frances Hardin. She's like a young adult author, especially the book A Face Like Glass, which is about a subterranean city where people have a limited number of faces, and it's a class analogy. And for noir, there's this old podcast called Blackjack Justice by Greg Taylor. It's basically, it's a podcast that's pretending to be a radio play from the 1950s.
That's very fun.
About Blackjack Justice and Trixie Dixon, girl detective. They're two hard-boiled detectives that work together and they solve crimes. And that's like my big touchstone for the noir setting or tone.
Oh, we'll absolutely link to those in the show notes. I feel like if as a parent you give your child a name like Blackjack Justice, there's going to be a specific career path they're going to follow.
Yeah. There's literally one episode like, if I styled it, it's actually Jonathan J. Justice, goes by Jack. It's like, Blackjack's a nickname. If I styled it JJ Justice, that sounds like a newspaper man to me.
It does, yeah. I will definitely link those in the show notes. These are some very fun references. I at one point spent an embarrassing amount of time on Fall in London and made no headway, but did enjoy the writing. Mm-hmm. Is there anything that you would like to plug to the audience?
I think I'm not the first person to mention it, but the actual play podcast that made me realize this medium could do such interesting and powerful and meaningful things is Friends at the Table. I recommend starting with Partisan. Partisan is their easiest season to get into.
That is a great recommendation.
I also want to shout out my favorite role-playing game of all time, which I mentioned briefly earlier. It's called Dialect. It's this game about language and how it dies. You play as an isolated community that speaks a unique dialect, and at the end of the game, your community dies out and your language is forgotten and no one remembers you.
That is incredibly tragic. We will absolutely link to that in the show notes as well. I'm going to plug your itch page, and I'll also link to it because I think Blood Velvet is a really cool rule set, and you have some other cool games up on there.
Yeah, Blood Velvet's the only tabletop game up there. I have some others in the works, but they get play tested when a campaign wants to play a game about closed room murder mysteries or pantheons of gods, which is not every campaign. So it's not exactly fast going. Yes, one more thing that's not exactly like a plug, but a thing to recommend if you're have that kind of DIY attitude.
Yes.
If you play your games on Discord, may I recommend making your own Discord bot. It's not that hard if you know Python. And I have my Discord bot set up to roll dice and draw tarot cards, and something that's become very useful, the name generator. So for a lot of campaigns, you have a name scheme for your NPCs, and you always want more NPC names. So just spend some time making a big list of first names and last names, and then turn into a simple name generator. And then I can just, anywhere in my Discord, I can go !name, and it will generate a random name. And it's fun to give characters random names. It's something like the Dread Pirate rolls dice, Lawrence. No further title or last name.
I love that. I will also then put in the show notes a link to How to Learn Python, because probably most people would benefit from that in their day-to-day lives.
It's a good language. If you're going to learn one language.
Yeah, I think I'd agree there. David, thank you so much for coming on Campaign Spotlight.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Of course.
That's all for this week.
I'm Production Master Riley.
And I'm Dungeon Inspector Jake.
If you enjoy the show, consider subscribing and leaving a review, which helps other people find Campaign Spotlight.
If you'd like to support our work, consider going to patreon.com/campaignspotlight and becoming a patron.
And if you want to leave the missive on the Baroness's credenza, it looks like you're going to have to wait for nightfall to climb that trellis.
For more on the show, including links to all our social media, visit foldedfrequencies.com/campaignspotlight.